Alright guys, before we get into actually more about character design, I want to talk a little bit about art, and particularly how to learn art. So I know our camp class thing that we have going on here is only going to be about a week, and if I'm being completely honest, I cannot teach you how to draw in a week. So if you're really interested in learning more, I've included a playlist by a YouTube artist who I think does a much better job of going over how to start, how to approach art, and things like that. So I'm going to do my best to give you kind of a rundown of what we're doing, but I don't think I can give you everything you're going to need to learn how to draw, but hopefully I can get you through making this sprite. I also just want to talk about expectations for your character and all of that. So again, we don't have a lot of time to learn, so I'm not looking for perfection here. I started drawing probably around the same time, about the age you guys are right now. I'm not entirely sure what the age group for this whole camp is, but I started drawing when I was like 13, right? So this is an example of something I made when I was about that age. You know, I'm not expecting perfection out of you guys, but if you want to do art and you want to continue with it, this is like what 8 years of progress will do for you. It's not super fast, but it's extremely rewarding. So yeah, I started when I was 13. I'm like 21 now. So it's something that if you want to learn, definitely worth starting as soon as you can. And honestly, don't worry about perfection. Like, that's going to be your biggest hang up. Just worry about making something that you enjoy, because that's really what art is about. If it makes you happy, then you're doing a great job. So I'm not expecting complete perfection out of you guys, but I want to help you as much as I can. So let's talk about kind of good places to start. So when you're looking to start art and you don't know like what art style you want to go for, or really how to approach it, what I like to do is find something that I enjoy and try to emulate that in some way. So I don't know if you guys have seen Avatar. It's kind of an older series, but it recently debuted on Netflix, which if you haven't, definitely go watch it. It's a fantastic show. It's also rather pretty. Like, not necessarily the first couple of seasons, but it's a really nice show, and it has a very easy, approachable art style. People like to make fun of anime, me included, but it's where I started to learn, and it's a great place to start. And I think emulating something like that is going to do wonders for you. So let's take a look at this picture of Aang here, right? So this is kind of an intimidating thing to start with, but what I like to do is kind of break him down into really basic shapes. If you start to understand what the human body or the human form sort of looks like in different shapes, you're going to be it's going to be a lot easier to actually draw them, right? So if you can start seeing things as circles, a terrible circle, as circles, ovals, blobs, squares, triangles, looking for those sorts of forms and trying to imagine them as not necessarily 2D but also 3D is going to help you so much. Being able to visualize something as a 3D object, even though it's represented in 2D space, is kind of the fundamentals of knowing how to draw something. And it's not something that's going to come super fast, but the more you practice it, the easier it's going to get. So if you want to kind of do an exercise, I would recommend finding a picture like this, either by an artist you enjoy or from a show you enjoy watching, and just sort of find those shapes, you know? So if we then see, that's a little bit easier to approach because his arms are all very rectangular or sausage shaped. He's got a very square chest, kind of an ovally rounded off head, and square hands. It certainly becomes a lot easier to approach now that it's broken down into smaller shapes. And once you do that, you can start drawing that on your own. So let's take a look at Zuko here. It's a very similar situation with a squared off chest and hips that are kind of almost somewhere between a square and a triangle. And his legs here. And getting clothing involved, you get shapes like these square sleeves. which are very characteristic of the sort of gi he's wearing. And then kind of more triangular hands since they're open. So doing something like this is a great way to kind of start visualizing what the human body looks like in motion. And this isn't just like, what's the word? It isn't completely confined to humans either. If you want to learn how to draw anything, I recommend this as the best place to start, is to find a picture of it and kind of break down how the shapes work and the shape language behind it. And from there, you can start to see how they connect together and how they come together into a whole human form. So I know this is very intimidating, and if you've never done any art before, it can be kind of a huge step, but if you can just bear with me a little bit here, if you actually start to put it into practice, it'll make a little bit more sense. So next, we're going to talk about actual character design. So if you have a good idea of where you're going with your game, then this should come together pretty quick. I imagine if you've already started making a game, you have a good idea of what you want your character to actually look like and who you want them to be. So next we're going to go over sort of how to make that into a physical, visual person. Okay, so what we're going to move on to next is actual character design. So what I'm working with is the basic human proportions that we went over in class. You can either use the one that you drew then, or you can start a new one based on the template and whatnot. But before you get started, it's important to kind of figure out who you're working with. So, like I said before, you probably have a pretty good idea of who your character is. So that's going to be super important. Figuring out who they are and why they're doing something is going to help you build to what they look like. So if you know who they are, you should probably also know kind of what time frame or what references you want to use for your character. So for instance, I'm building one right now just to kind of give you an idea. And I'm kind of thinking something like a Street Fighter-y game based in the 80s, and I want this character to look pretty fashionable for the 80s. So I'm looking up 80s fashion and finding stuff that relates to what I want my character to look like. It's always a good idea to look up these historical, not necessarily historical, but like real life examples of what you want your character to be wearing or like using for their weaponry or whatnot. And that'll give you something to kind of base everything else around. References are so important in art. I cannot stress that enough. But once you know your time frame and kind of where you're going with things, you should probably take a good thought about how that person got their equipment. I know that seems like a kind of a weird detail, but I think it's super important. So, say this character I'm working on, for instance, she probably found her stuff from various like stores and whatnot. They're all bought. However, if you're doing something like a Mad Max style, like warrior junker sort of person, they probably cobbled their gear together from things they could find, like car parts and stuff. And if you're doing like, say, a James Bond type spy character, then they probably have everything built tailored to them. Or if you're doing like a soldier type or like space bounty hunter sort of person, they probably are wearing some sort of uniform, something standard. So that sort of thing can add a lot to your character and kind of add some sort of story to it. So what they look like and what they're using and what they're wearing is going to inform the person looking at them where they got stuff, maybe their personality, maybe they have like trinkets they hold on to for good luck, or maybe they're using a certain weapon that's like weird and out there, but it's what they like trained in, and that's going to inform the character. So these are all things that I think about when I'm making a character. And finding good references based on that is what's going to actually help you build out the character. So as you can see, I'm kind of going over my sketch pretty loosely in the same brush and sort of strokes, and that's just sort of the style that I like to use. However, feel free to mess around with different brushes and figure out line art if you want to. It's usually good practice to make a rough sketch and then go over it again with cleaner lines so that you kind of get a better feel for what's going on. It looks a little bit more professional. Aaron is really good at line art. If you have specific questions about that, he would be a great person to talk to, or you can ask your breakout instructor. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up everything on that front. Again, feel free to run things past me or ask me questions or talk to your breakout instructor about your character. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over the basics of character design, I want to talk more about how to make a really solid character concept. So, to start that, we have to talk a little bit about something called shape language. Now, what this is how people interpret shapes and how those shapes communicate with each other. I'm going to include an article in the email today to just sort of give you a more in-depth explanation because there are people who can explain it a lot better than I can. But I'm just going to go over kind of how I use it. So this one, this is a concept that I did for a Dungeons and Dragons Starfinder character. This is a character that you saw in our first week when we were talking about reference images. This is the character that I play for my Starfinder game. But this is probably like the fourth iteration of her. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got to this design. So it started with a concept of I want to play this character. I'm going to make her an orc with some undead elements, but she's going to be following somebody called, Chimera. So that's very monster based. So I decided um, that I wanted to start with somebody who had like a big connection to a monster, right? And so instead of focusing on like the Chimera, like my friend did when he made the order that she belongs to, I decided to focus on the Nemean lion, which is a monster that Hercules fought in like his first or second trial. It's a lion whose hide cannot be pierced by mortal weapons. So I thought that'd be a cool place to start with this character. So to start off with, I wanted to make her like pretty large and imposing. She's like a soldier with a big gun. I wanted her to cut a very scary figure. So I started collecting reference images. Let me just pull this down so you can kind of see them. Um, so these are some of the ones that I found that I liked that were pretty heavy armor, but not anything that's too crazy and that I felt like I could go along with. Looking up stuff that you want to replicate, I think I just searched like sci-fi heavy armor to find these, and just kind of looking through Google is a really great place to find reference images. But anyway, this was just the first design. So I just kind of started playing with shapes. I'll show you why I made this layer so I can kind of point them out to you. Uh, the shape language here is not super defined because pretty much all it is, that was a group, not a layer, my bad, um, is kind of angles versus curves, right? So on this one, we've got very sharp, like triangular sort of situation on like the shoulder pads, whereas this one, we've got a lot more rounded stuff going on. Like even in the helmet, you've got this like angry eyebrows situation and then like this sort of rounded off curve. So I started with her silhouette and then I moved on from there to build up the armor. So if we just bump up the opacity on this, you can kind of see what I'm talking about, where you've got a lot more curves here than you do here. It's a lot more angles. So that's where I started. So once I was finished with these two like initial concepts, I wanted to focus on the helmet because I wanted it to kind of convey that thought. So I wasn't quite happy with what I had, and I wanted to focus on this. So I was just working in black and white because it's the easiest way to sort of figure things out without worrying about color. So as you can see, I started with like this, which was based off of a paper sketch that I did. A lot more lion-y. This one doesn't have it, but I kind of liked the like cords and like wires that I had going on in place of an actual like fur mane. So I took what I liked out of that and I made the helmet design, and that's what everything else was based off of. Now, what I want to point out here is kind of the shapes that I started to use. So Control Backspace to fill, drop the opacity on this, and then we can make a new layer and draw in the purple. So as you can see here, I decided to go with some of the more angular designs. So this whole thing is just very sharp angles. So if we bump up the opacity on this, you can just kind of start to see that. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about being able to break down designs into very simple shapes. So I wanted her to have a screen that could like display different emotions, and it started off kind of like this fun like little cat face, but it's moved on to just like eyes, which can be very expressive on their own. And then I decided to add this blast shield, which again mirrors the same shapes that this has. It's kind of a trapezoid situation. Okay, so once I was happy with how the helmet looked, I moved on to the final concept. This was like level 1 concept here. So as you can see, we've got the eyes again instead of like the weird cat face. I just want to highlight how the shapes in the helmet went on to dictate everything else in the armor. So I'm gonna choose, let's choose like a blue. I feel like that's gonna stand out pretty well. Yeah, that looks good, I think. So starting with the helmet, I wanted to pick out a shape. So I picked out this kind of trapezoid triangle shape. Like, see this combo here? So I'm not talking like shape language. Oftentimes you'll see it be like a circle, a square, a triangle. I wanted to go something a little bit more advanced than that. And when I make a character, I try to find these sorts of shapes and mirror them everywhere in the character to kind of bring the whole design together as one. So this trapezoid triangle shape, you can see it starts to get mirrored everywhere else. So here we've got that trapezoid. Let's see here. This is a really good example. Trapezoid, triangle, and you can see it's not exactly the same everywhere because see that triangle got mirrored for the knee pads. So everywhere has that very strong base that kind of goes up into the trapezoid shape. And even on the little like highlights that I did on the armor, in the original concept, you can see that all of those little triangles are LEDs or like glowing lights that you would see in like a lot of sci-fi armor. But I decided to go with a more like rugged paint look because I didn't want her to look super like refined or like, well, it's still future-y, but it's more like Star Wars future versus like Star Trek future, if that makes sense. Like I wanted it to be a little bit more grungy and like space opera-y. So this again, we've got this trapezoid triangle mirrored in the chest plate. This is a pentagon, but again, you can break it down into those shapes. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say shape language, is just something that you can mirror within your whole character and kind of bring it together. The other thing I like to think about when I'm designing a character is how it actually wraps around the body. We will get back to that in a second, but I just want to drive home the idea of mirroring these same angles and shapes. See, like even on this, that's pretty much that exact same shape. That is going to help you maintain a very cohesive look with your character, as opposed to, say, if like her upper half was all of these nice sharp angles and then her bottom half had all these weird curves to them. So yeah, start with a couple different ideas like I have going here. Mess around, find out what you like. What I did here, I did a couple more concepts, and then I came together and brought all of the ideas from all of them that I liked and appreciated, like see all the chords in the back, kind of mirror remain, and I brought them all together into one. So that was like the level 1 concept. So I'd been playing this character for a while, and I came back to her and did this. Now, from a design standpoint, I would say that this is a weaker design. Like, obviously, my art has gotten a little bit better since then, so I think it's a better picture. But from a design standpoint, there's less mirroring of that shape. Like, you kind of get it in the back here that I didn't really flesh out the first time. You have this, like, this triangle here and whatnot, but her pants are just pants. They don't have the same, like, structure that her original Greaves did, but this was a move from heavy armor to light armor, so I wanted to kind of show that. But you still have some of those shapes, but they're just kind of reduced. So, I hope that explains how I approach this sort of thing, but I want you to know that it's not just confined to just armor, and I actually have a concept here that is even older than the other one I just showed you, that I did of mage robes. So the thing about mage robes, right, like, there's no structure to them, they're cloth. But even though they're just cloth, they still have this sort of mirroring shape pattern to them. So all of this gold trim Here, let me put another layer there, is this same sort of triangle shape. It's like an acute swooping triangle and even a little bit of a zigzag. So even though it's not like forged literally into metal, there's still these shapes that repeat everywhere. Like even in the crossing of the belts, we get a little bit of this acute swooping triangle. It's a lot more soft of a shape language, but it's still extremely effective. So even if you're not working with like heavy armor, and you're just working with clothes, it's still something you can incorporate. Like even with like logos on more traditional clothing or like more modern clothing that you can get good references for, finding little things that you can make kind of mirror each other and reflect off of each other is going to help immensely to make your whole concept be more cohesive. And I know this is a pretty advanced concept for character design, but if you're happy with what you have right now and you're looking for a way to make it more cohesive and more, well, a stronger concept, this is a really good place to start. And shape language is something that a lot of people will talk about when they talk about character design, and I think it's worth knowing, even though I don't always follow it. So please read that article that explains a lot more about like what squares, triangles, what they all kind of mean when you look at them and how we interpret them from like a symbolic standpoint. Other than that, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions about how all of this works. And as always, feel free to contact me or Finn or any of your other breakout instructors. So, yeah, thank you. So for your challenge today, I would say build out the sketch you made in class today and make it into your full concept for a character. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, not looking for perfection here, but this is what you're going to be building your sprite off of. And doing all of those animations is going to be a lot easier if you know what your character looks like beforehand.